Hello and welcome to another English language A-level video with me, Paul, from the QE here in Darlington. And this little video is getting you ready for your paper 2. So the language diversity, section A, diversity question. Now in the actual paper you have a choice. You can either do the language diversity essay question or you can do the language change question. And in this video we're just going to take a look at language diversity question. So here we go. Here's the question. Evaluate the idea that a person's language is completely determined by their regional background. Now the first thing that you need to do is to pick apart the language of the question. The question is always going to begin with that command word evaluate, which is slightly different to analysing, because when you're evaluating, you're weighing up competing arguments and you're coming to a balanced conclusion about which has more validity. So that shows that you are going to need a good introduction and you're going to need a conclusion as well when you're evaluating. Let's pick apart some of the semantics of this particular question. Evaluate the idea that a person's language is completely determined by their regional background. Now, first of all, a person's language is a complex thing. As we know, language is made up of different language levels, and to name but 3, we have lexis, i.e. people's vocabulary choices. We have grammar, i.e. people's morphology and syntax, and we have phonology, i.e. the pronunciation features. So language is a pluralistic, complicated thing. It will show elements surely of dialect, i.e. a person's regional grammar and vocabulary choices, accent, whether that be RP, received pronunciation, or non-RP. Language will also be connected with the social groups that people belong to, i.e. you will use socialects. And then you've got idiolect. Who are you calling an idiolect? Idiolect, meaning somebody's unique fingerprint of language. When we're talking about language, language can be either standard or non-standard. It can be RP or non-RP. So it's a complicated element. Point number 2 about the question would be this term completely determined. Now, completely determined does not mean the same thing as just influenced by. Completely determined is quite dogmatic. And what it's doing is it's reducing this complex phenomenon to just one particular sociolinguistic variable. And I say unto you, what about these other diversity areas of social class, ethnicity, age, gender, occupation, sexuality, blah blah. So regional background is surely just one of many sociolinguistic variables. And also, what about people's natural tendency to accommodate others? Here I'm drawing upon Howard Giles' accommodation theory and the idea that in certain situations people are likely to do convergence. In other situations they might do divergence, and therefore a person's language features are not fixed. They are dynamic. They're not static. Okay, so I think we can challenge the whole basis of the question. It seems overly dogmatic to call a person's language completely determined by their regional background. And of course this is very important that you do, because to get to the highest grades in this, in the AO2 mark scheme, they're talking about challenging the question. So, and then obviously you'd want to dive into this noun phrase regional background, which is arguing that your location is the most important element that is infecting your lexical, grammatical and phonological choices. But you'd also want to show awareness that perhaps linguistic differences in the UK, at any rate, between regions, are sort of reducing over time. This is Paul Kurzweil's idea of dialect levelling. So plenty to get your teeth into at the very beginning. I'm not suggesting that you spend an entire page simply dissecting the semantics of the question, but in your 4 or 5 sentences that you're doing in your introduction of about half a page, you really need to show that you're not just going to be producing pre-learnt material and that you are responding to the demands of the given question. Evaluate the idea that a person's language is completely determined by their regional background. Here is where you need to be selecting your AO2 ideas. A quick reminder about your AOs. So this is your diversity question that gets a mark out of 30. It's got 2 AOs. You've got AO1, which is marked out of 10, which is your terms, e.g. diphthong, and about your written expression, i.e. your ability to write in topic sentences, logical paragraphs, and to have control over your spelling, punctuation and grammar. That's AO1. AO2, however, is worth 2/3 of the mark, and this is your knowledge. This is your knowledge about concepts and theories and research, stuff that you wouldn't have known as a GCSE student. So it's not enough to be writing in a sort of commonsensical way. You clearly need to be drawing upon important studies. So, which AO2 ideas would be most relevant to this question of geographical background, I hear you say? Well, first of all, you could show some knowledge about the historical development of UK dialects and accents and show that the UK is actually quite unique in its diversity. And maybe you'd want to take the examiner on a little road trip around the UK, showing off your knowledge of the sort of distinctive features of different areas of the country. Linguistically, the northeast, for example, we could go up to Newcastle and look at Geordie words like the material verb gan. We could make the point that gan is an Old English word that you're going to find used by the Angles. That area of the country was settled linguistically by the Angles, and therefore it's got a deep heritage. Scouse, Liverpudlian, is also a dialect that has been certainly influenced by migration, and obviously one of the key migrant groups to come across is the Irish. But they are not alone, because Scottish and Welsh and migrants from all over the country have actually ended up in Liverpool and created this distinctive language feature. So you might take a word like Aussie instead of hospital, or you might hear da and ma instead of dad and mum. So the elongated vowel sounds and the elision of the consonant phonemes at the ends of those words are something that you could argue is distinctively Liverpudlian. But if we move just 30 miles eastwards to Manchester, we're listening to Mancunian, and it sounds completely different to Liverpool, despite the relative closeness to the port. And you could look at, happy, for example. So you could look at the final phoneme on the end of the adjective happy and look to see how that's a shortened I form, whereas in RP that will be an elongated form. And the final point that you could make about Mancunian is that, like Liverpool, it's a product of lots of migration, particularly during the Industrial Revolution. But on this one, it tends to be internal migration, either people moving to Manchester to work in the factories, and the cotton mills tended to be from the region, and so bringing sort of distinctively Lancastrian regional forms. Now, we could go on, couldn't we? We could talk about Cockney rhyming slang, or multicultural London English, or maybe you have done research into another area of the country which has very distinctive linguistic features. This is your opportunity to use that knowledge. Here's another set of AO2 ideas. This is dialect levelling. This is the claim that traditional dialect features are actually disappearing over time, i.e. language across the country is becoming more homogeneous and standardised, and that therefore a person's regional background is having a less significant effect on people's language. So you might go into the reasons that are given, and in the textbook it talks about, how social mobility is affecting dialect levelling, how geographical mobility is doing the same thing, how we have a reduction in rural labour and people moving towards urban areas from the rural areas, and the influence and exposure of media as well, so that people are more exposed to different varieties of language forms. So there are all sorts of interesting sociological reasons why dialect levelling might be happening, but you might also zoom in on certain holdouts, both lexically and grammatically, where you could say, well, there are certain areas where actually dialect levelling still doesn't seem to be happening. And classic ones would include things like alternative words for alley, like wind, for example, or alternative synonyms for bread roll, like barm cake, for example. And the other ones that people often talk about are alternatives for the children's game TIG, and of course training shoes as well. So whilst agreeing that dialect levelling is a phenomenon that is happening across the country, you could still throw in acknowledgements that actually there's still some very distinctive diversity which is likely to continue. And then you'd want to throw in your relative case studies, okay, which are to do with identity, because regional background doesn't just work in isolation, it links in with people's perceptions about their identity. Take William Labov's Martha's Vineyard study. I know, a very old study from the 1960s, and one of the evaluations that you would make of it is that perhaps this is too dated now to be given validity here in the 21st century. An old study, yes, but very interesting in terms of people's unconscious choices in language that are to do with their perceived identity. So this is about those Martha's Vineyard locals between the ages of 31 and 45 who articulate diphthong phonemes, ow and a, in very distinctive ways, so that it sounds closer to the fishing people of the island, and particularly in the presence of the New York tourists who arrive on the scene. What they're doing is they are converging with the fishing people on the island in order to show their Martha's Vineyard integrity and credentials, and they're diverging away from the somewhat disliked and resented tourists coming onto the island. So yes, regional background is important there, but it's mixed in importantly with people's notions of identity. A second example, and it's important with your examples that you do a nice variety, so they're not just ancient ones from 50 years ago, but Rob Drummond's here. I know it's not bang up to date, but I think it's 2010, and this is his Manchester study of Polish heritage speakers, 40 of them, and he noticed there were interesting phonological features going on there with the ing progressive aspect endings of verbs, where some of the speakers who were intending to return back to their East European countries actually were pronouncing the ing form in Polish ways that was quite distinctively different from anything that you'd hear elsewhere in Manchester. So again, regional background is important there, but also it's to do with people's aspirations for the future and their perceived identity. A third example would take you to Belfast in the 1980s, where the married couple of the Milroys looked at the language of working class Belfast communities and noticed that contrary to a lot of research, actually the males there in particular, working class communities, those males who were staying at home and were unemployed, they were tending to use more standardized forms than the females who were going out working in factories and therefore had their own closed network, which meant that they had quite distinctive regional dialect features. So I've just thrown in 3 examples. There are many, many other examples that you could put in there, but Labov's Martha's Vineyard study from the 1960s is a good one. Drummond's Manchester study of Polish heritage speakers from 2010, and then the Milroy's study of working class Belfast communities would all be relevant to geographical background, but with the proviso that they are also linked in with other aspects which are more complicated to do with identity. Move on. Evaluate the idea that a person's language is completely determined by their regional background. Now, in terms of writing your essay, topic sentences are your friend. You must come up with 5 or 6 strong topic sentences which reference back to the question that show to your examiner you are answering this question asked. Here are some examples. Regional dialect and accent features in the UK, such as in the Newcastle area, continue to influence, though not completely determine, people's language. Some would claim that dialect levelling has led to a reduction in the influence of regional background on people's language. Regional background usually links with other complicated sociolinguistic factors to determine people's language features. A study of how and why young people use MLE shows how regional background is not the only deterministic factor on people's language. Those are some examples of topic sentences. And in your topic sentences, you're going to peel, you're going to make your point, which is the topic sentence. You're going to explain the point. Then you're going to provide evidence that backs up the point. Then importantly, you're going to evaluate the validity of the studies and the claims that are being made. And then L, you're going to link back to either to the topic sentence or to the overall question in itself. So I say to you, peeling, point, explain, evidence, evaluate and link. That's how you construct a decent paragraph. Evaluate the idea that a person's language is completely determined by their regional background. Now let's have a look at a paragraph. Basil Bernstein was a British sociolinguist who in the 1960s claimed that children's educational achievement was heavily influenced by their family background. He argued that working class families tended to communicate in restricted code with limited vocabulary, incomplete sentences and deixis. This creates a problem for working class children at school who are required to understand and use elaborated code, standard sentences, more sophisticated lexis, the more formal language expected in education. However, another linguist, William Labov, challenged Bernstein's idea. Here is a student who clearly knows a lot of AO2, and there's a lot of detail there about Basil Bernstein. So that is commendable. However, it's not clear that this is answering the question. And it's not using any of the key phrases from the question. It's not mentioning the noun phrase regional background, and it's not mentioning the verbal phrase completely determined. So it seems like this student is just going to write about Basil Bernstein no matter what the heck the question is. And it's not really analytical or evaluative. All it's doing is it's presenting information rather than using AO2 knowledge to actually support an argument. So I've just marked a whole load of my students who are doing this kind of thing where they're showing some good AO2 knowledge, but it's not really directed sufficiently enough to answer the question. Here is what you should do. Evaluate the idea that a person's language is completely determined by their regional background. Studies of teenage language in different parts of the UK show that regional background is just one of many determiners on people's speech. Both Cheshire's 1982 Reading study and Moore's 2010 Bolton study suggest that age, gender, and perceptions of group membership are as important as location in influencing the speech of teenagers at school. In both studies, non-standard language, such as the frequent use of the verb form were, double negation, and the verb ain't were deliberately performed to demonstrate gang membership and to acquire covert prestige. Language here is being used as an important social signifier. Regional background clearly influences people's choice of non-standard forms, but other forms, factors such as gang membership, seem equally important. Now I hope you can see that that is actually much better quality writing than the previous one that's done about Basil Bernstein. And here's why. It keeps referencing the keywords in the question. So, for example, here it quotes regional background. This is nudging your examiner in the ribs to say, "Oi, I am answering your question." It's also using the AO2 knowledge to support an argument. In this case, two good studies to draw upon, because you've got your Jenny Cheshire and your Emma Moore studies, which are about language and group membership. So the AO2 knowledge is there for a good reason. It's supporting an argument. The other thing it's not doing, it's not over-explaining unnecessary information. Because the student could have gone into Emma Moore and talked about the 4 different categories of Eden Valley girls and geeks and townies and all of that information in a whole load of laborious detail. And that's a bit of a trap, isn't it? Because actually that's a diversion from answering the question. So you need to get to the nub of these particular theories and studies, get to the essence of them, and don't over-explain in too much elaborate detail the methodologies of what was going on. So bear all of that in mind, and what I would recommend that you do right now is to sit down with a piece of paper and to handwrite an answer to that question. Evaluate the idea that a person's language is completely determined by their regional background. Good luck.